This is Terms of Reference podcast number 164.
But if you look at where the risks are and the rents are in government, it's, the things like big infrastructure projects, it's the oil, mining and gas sector, it's also where, armaments and those kind of things, so it's everywhere contracts are huge and there are huge businesses involved and government doesn't really have the skills to manage that.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. How much money will your government spend this year? In 2016, the government of the United States spent over $3.5 trillion. China threw down $2.8 trillion, and the UK just over $1 trillion. Worldwide, governments spent a combined total of $22.7 trillion. My point here is that there is a ton of money being spent by governments around the globe to procure products and services. It would be great to know where exactly all that money goes, right? I mean, in most of the major economies out there, there's an expectation that the public should know what their hard-earned taxes are funding. And there are some big figures out there, usually represented in pie charts that are relatively easy to access. But what about specifics? Governments spend a great deal of money internally for things like defense. But especially in a place like the United States, governments rely on contractors for products and services of all types, everything from vaccines to uniforms. In order to find out what any individual contractor received for their work takes a massive amount of effort, and then the available information often is less than satisfying. As you can imagine, this is unfortunately the beginning of the corruption game, but equally as important, it's also the beginning of the inefficiency game. Honestly, just thinking about the numbers involved gives me the willies, and how to crack this problem? Forget about it. Luckily for us, that's exactly what my guest for the 164th Terms of Reference podcast thinks about and works on all day. Gavin Hayman is the executive director of the Open Contracting Partnership, an organization that seeks to open up public contracting through disclosure, data engagement so that the huge sums of money involved that are spent honestly, fairly, and effectively. And as the former executive director of Global Witness, Gavin knows a thing or two about how to uncover unsavory practices of government contractors. You're going to love this episode, where Gavin and I talk about the origins of the Open Contracting Partnership, the size of the issues they're trying to tackle, information asymmetries, and how we all benefit when governments and contractors get it right. And personally, I was surprised by some of Gavin's examples. They're not just from where you'd expect to find massive transparency. And I think you'll be surprised as well. I spoke with Gavin in London. And hey guys, just a reminder, if you like what you're hearing, if you like these conversations about innovation in the social sector, there's that subscribe button right there on whatever podcast app you happen to be. Just click it and you'll never miss an episode. Now, one last thing before we get started, just a quick word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com.
Hello, Gavin. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thank you. Total honor and a pleasure to be here.
Gavin, you are the executive director of an organization that's known as the Open Contracting Partnership, or Open Contracting for short. I was attracted to you for a number of reasons, and as I told you in the pre-show, it was especially intriguing to me to know that you used to be the executive director of Global Witness as well. So I think this is just going to be a fantastic conversation that you've got. There could be a ton of meat here and a great history. But where are you sitting today?
So at the moment I'm in London in the UK. For our listeners, it's the general election. So there's interesting political dynamics going on in the UK with Brexit and everything else. But let's be honest, we're focusing on the really important stuff of international development here.
Well, what is that? Actually, let me ask you the question right there, though. Does open contracting, your whole piece is around how do we bring more transparency into government contracting, these large amounts of money that flow to infrastructure, to roads, to anything, buying books and pencils, as you say on your site. Does this election hold any ups or downs for where you need to advocate in the UK?
That's a great question. It's been, I would think it's fair to say, a remarkably uninspiring election in terms of people are talking more about personalities than they are about issues, right? And there's one big issue that everybody's obsessed about, which is the UK leaving the European Union. It would be nice to have more forward-looking dialogue about what will the UK economy look like 5 years from now. That hasn't really happened. There is a little bit in one manifesto, particularly around smarter, faster digital government. I think whoever is in charge, open contracting's a compelling pitch to, whichever shade grade of kind of political government we get, because there isn't any money left realistically in the pot, and government's going to have to be smarter and faster and better and more responsive to its citizens. And perhaps you could almost partly see the Brexit vote as a kind of a cry out, about kind of traditional elites and the role of government. So I think open contracting should speak to those issues. And, basically open contracting in a nutshell is about better, more efficient government, particularly through, public purchasing. It's one of the key things government does, right? Delivers goods and services to its citizens. It's relevant to every government in the world. We're seeing a wave of innovation globally and not in the countries you perhaps expect. And that's why I'm kind of excited to be leading the charge on open contracting.
So unpack that just a little bit more for me. So open contracting, and you were kind of alluding to it, that contracting is something that every government in the world does. It's just a key piece. Like, why is that so important? Maybe try to give us some numbers or some specifics about what's the depth of the issue here that we're looking at.
Yeah, so I should talk about what the open contracting partnership is, and then I should also talk about why it's so important. So let's start with the why. First, the numbers. So your governments, if you tot it up around the world, spend about $9.5 trillion US dollars, per year on providing goods and services to citizens. That's about 15% of global GDP. It's about 30% of government spending in total. So it's a vast amount of money. It's hard to kind of imagine how big it is. But if you were to stack dollar bills all the way to the moon and back, that still wouldn't be 9.5 trillion US dollars. So it's a bit
and we're talking
over.
Stacking them like one on top of the other, not end to end, right?
Yeah, totally. One on top of the other. So it's just this unfathomably, extraordinarily large, pot of money. It's one of the key things government does effectively is provide goods and services to citizens. And if you like, the role of the open contracting partnership is to transform that through both open data and through much smarter business and civic engagement, to just create better, standards of both transparency, accountability, but just also more responsive and creative ways to solve government problems. At the moment, people see procurement perhaps at the end of a discussion where people said, this is what we need to buy to provide goods and services. And that whole sort of smartness and responsiveness about how people think about what to buy to solve problems is also a really interesting piece of the puzzle. So summarize it again, you've got open data around the entire flow of the government deal chain. And by that, I mean all the different stages of public procurement, starting with the issue of forming government contracts, the planning stage, then through to the actual tender and award of contracts, and then very crucially about delivery of those contracts too. Using open data to track that whole deal chain in real time, as I said, sort of better business and civic engagement so that government can actually have a dialogue with the marketplace about what a good solution looks like, and also, a dialogue with citizens about what kind of projects should be delivered and by when and whether they're actually on target.
There's about 1,000 directions we can go. Before we do that, though, whose idea was this? I mean, you came on board in 2015, but I think the genesis of the organization is 2012, a few years earlier than that. Who woke up one day and said, this is something that has to be done, and how did it get started? What was the energy required to bring this off the ground?
It's totally fascinating. It was the World Bank that started doing this, right? And the World Bank was basically seeing the fundamental challenge everywhere it was working was in this contracting process. So they kept seeing public procurement and public contracting as a challenge across all the governments it was working on. And it started thinking about that, in 2012 and started putting together, if you like, a team of people to begin to unpack the issue and look at what are the options for strategic interventions. And then the bank scaled that up to create a kind of loose affiliation of people thinking about this, which is called the Open Contracting Partnership. And then that was spun out of the World Bank formally in 2015. And so the Open Contracting Partnership itself now is silo-busting collaboration of businesses, like a civil society, various different government representatives and technologists around open contracting and taking the ideas behind open contracting, as I said, both the open data and the business civic engagement to scale globally. And it was spun out of the bank explicitly so it could be disruptive and creative. The bank is a huge monolithic bureaucracy. I think it's fair to say that. also so that we can work globally. This is an issue for all governments. As you said, it kind of started with the UK, but also the US, thinking about, this week, President Trump announcing these, like huge $1 trillion infrastructure investments for, middle-income countries, Mexico and Ukraine, in particular hotbeds of innovation and open contracting, through to countries like Nigeria and Afghanistan. You think Afghanistan, President Ghani has put public procurement reform at the center of his kind of, promise to deliver better results for Afghan citizens. So it's a kind of a globally embracing initiative. And then the last thing I'd say is also the bank doesn't really do smart political engagement, like create global norms. And that's something that we need to do to kind of make open contracting a kind of globally identified both standard, but also a globally kind of identified requirement. So businesses and citizens around the world are calling out for better, fairer, more open standards of doing public procurement.
You put Ukraine on the table, you put Afghanistan on the table. I admit that, I was born in the United States. I've been overseas for quite a long time now, but those are probably, for many of our listeners, those are not the two most open countries that you would think of. But you're saying that these are policies that have been embraced by those countries. How does that work? I mean, are you, as the partnership, you go and knock on the door of someone, you're like, say, hey, what's something tangible that we could sink our teeth into about how you engage with a government? It could be the US, could be UK, whatever.
Sure. And I guess we could put some of the actual impact stories that we've done, because our knowledge and learning and catching impact is really important, on a link to the podcast. So let's take Ukraine as perhaps the kind of best and most sort of evident example of open contracting and the promise of open contracting in action. So you have the Maidan revolution, right, that happened there, the revolution of dignity, and that was kind of 2013, 2014. One of the key challenges was, how do you rebuild trust, right, in a country like that? And part of that rebuilding trust, one of the key things the government sort of identified politically was public procurement reform as a key topic. And the reason why was, the previous public procurement was a Soviet system. It was totally sclerotic, and it was key to, if you like, the power of the previous set of political elites. They would have their favorite government crony contractors. They would loot the system for huge amounts of money, and that rent would keep the kind of political autocracy in Ukraine going. So that was one of the key, if you like, things people were protesting against in the Maidan revolution. At the same time, you have, let's call it, the conflict in the East that was going on. And so people also needed to suddenly procure in an effective and transparent way emergency humanitarian supplies. So, for example, 80,000 sleeping bags to help the refugees from Donbass, in the freezing Ukrainian winter. So it was a fascinating kind of double story here. One is the top-down political reform that needs to happen in the country as part of the kind of rebuilding trust. And actually you also have an incredible civic movement. And this is both businesses and citizens acting as civic actors, to help procure these emergency humanitarian supplies. And they want to do that in a really transparent way. The open contracting, at the heart of open contracting in our work, is data standards, so an open standard that joins together all the data and the documents that could flow from public procurement, and as I said, across the chain of public procurement, and renders that accessible and transparent to all actors, both businesses and citizens. And so they built a kind of an emergency system to procure things transparently that was called ProZorro. And ProZorro, nothing to do with Zorro the swashbuckler, though certainly, to be frank, it had large swashbuckling elements in terms of what the guys were trying to achieve. But this incredible coalition that was put together of both businesses and citizens, and sort of civic tech coalition, if you like, to create this new transparent system. ProZorro means transparent in Ukraine. Built this kind of system based around the open contracting data standard as its core data model about how to procure things openly, where you can follow the money, but also it has lots of elements that are very smart, such as running reverse auctions for goods. And they built that in order to procure these supplies. What is fascinating is it has now become the default mechanism for public procurement across the entire country. So one of the fascinating things is how this really disruptive project with transparency at the heart, and the motto there in the ProZorro is everyone sees everything, if you like, has now been scaled up across the country and become the default, open contracting platform for procuring goods and services in Ukraine. And the story is fascinating. We can put it on your web links.
Yeah, for sure. And you're sort of talking about the impact as well. I mean, what has that changed in the country as far as for the average citizen or for an average business or something like that? Is there a tangible, palpable shift for them as well?
Yeah, so it's really important for us that we write these things up and measure that impact. So you can genuinely say, if you do open contracting properly, you will save, a fortune in money, fortune in time, and rebuild trust. In Ukraine, it's been really interesting. So there has been a measured reduction, I think it's about, of the perception of corruption in the public procurement process. And it's very significant. You're talking, like a 40% reduction in the perception of corruption. The government estimates it has saved over, I think it's $660 million US dollars and counting. You can now measure that in real time. To explain how those savings are calculated, that's based on what they were expecting to pay and what the actual price was, right? And that price, that will change in terms of percentage savings over time as people get better at planning for procurements and perhaps spending less money on them to start off with. It's also seen thousands of businesses register as government suppliers and an increasing competition, as in number of businesses bidding per contract. And I think it's up 50 to 100%, depending on how exactly you measure it. And then in addition to that, you're also seeing a significant reduction in sole source, single bid contracts being awarded. So contracting authorities' behavior about how they're doing things has got better. And then we worked really clearly. It's worth shouting out some of the amazing partners on this. This ProZorro platform was co-owned. It's the Ministry of Economic Development that had an amazing minister, Max Nefedov, who actually came from private equity and had a real can-do business approach to things. And there's also Transparency International Ukraine. And then it's also semi-owned by some of the big tech groups in Ukraine who run sort of the online marketplaces. So prom.ua is one, Alibaba Ukraine is another. So that gives you some idea of this really interesting collaboration. And it's probably like a great example of how open contracting sort of happens globally. It's this really interesting mix of possibly business or civic innovation going into government and achieving scale across government, and the power of both disruptive tech, but also, as well as that, the power of political cheerleading. So, we've been able to sort of cheerlead for the open contracting reforms in Ukraine, and there's also been pushback by different parts of government. So Minister Nefedov, had to offer his resignation at one point when there was political interference in transparency and accountability, and, fortunately didn't have to resign, and, that political interference went away. And then they've also won for some things like the Open Government Awards, which is from the Open Government Partnership, which is like the kind of, de facto forum for sharing open government innovations. So it's a really interesting mix of different actors moving at different points in time.
So if I'm thinking, let's take it to another U country like Uganda, where we know that it's a slow roll, decentralization, opening of government kind of process, but there's still a lot of corruption. How do you take a first step in a place like that? Maybe you already have. Maybe I'm talking out of turn here. But what would be the partnerships look at that? Or is that your role? Are you there as a cheerleader and saying, hey, if you want us to help you do this, we can do it? Or are you actively advocating and in there sort of fighting for this?
Yeah, so we're an active advocate, I think, is, we kind of want to build a field of policy and practice and open contracting around the world, not be the field. So we're not planning to be the implementer everywhere. We're not after contracts to implement open contracting. We are the cheerleaders for open by default. And we work both nationally and internationally. So Uganda is really interesting in that open contracting is taking some route there, particularly a collaboration with the Roads Agency and an amazing set of local sort of civic social entrepreneurs, which is the African Center for Information, right? So there's a wonderful set of people there, AFIC it's called, and they're effectively working on right to know issues and freedom of information across Africa, but particularly in Uganda, in their home country. And then they effectively have looks at then how you go beyond just requesting post hoc contracting information, so filing an information request, to how you achieve it at scale, and you get the government sort of publish proactively rather than reactively. So they are trying that out in real time at the moment with the Roads Agency. I don't want to kind of jinx the project by talking about it too much, but because Uganda's a tough environment. But they're what open contracting we really try to do is you really think about as a kind of collaborative, got these amazing partners, and we're more about the partners we are about ourselves. That makes sense. As I said, we're not trying to do it everywhere. We're trying to kind of create the conditions where it can thrive everywhere. We really try to focus in on the user needs. And so I think the 4 key user needs that we obsess about, one is, value for money. So government wants to get better value for money for its public contracting. Everywhere in the world has both horror stories about public integrity in public contracting, obviously, because it's where the kind of money and discretion is, and perhaps relationships with business can be too close in government.
I'm thinking of the $2,500 toilet seat or the $2,500 wrench in the United States or something like that.
You're totally right. I mean, there's a fascinating one in Ukraine, which was like $100 mops in, a hospital, for example. So, just absolutely, the openness has uncovered these like horror stories of like dodgy contracting,
Yeah, and that's an easy win, right? Because you can go to literally any place in the world and say, look, don't even call it fat, just there's indiscretion happening here. And exactly. it needs to come out and needs to have a light shown on it.
Yeah, completely. And it's also about how just, government can just be, terrifyingly inefficient, just mismanaged contracts, right? And particularly the bigger the contract gets, the more perhaps, the concentration of corporate power is, and the better companies are, gaming the system.
Well, yeah, take me there. And you were about to mention, I think, another example in Chicago, which I'd love to hear. But can you unpack that just a little bit for me? Like, for the listeners, where so like as an organization gets bigger, I'm thinking of like the giant organizations in the U.S. or in Europe somewhere, where it's because you have one of these, let's just say, like a jet, or a military contract, because it's such a huge contract, something like a $2,000 wrench can slip through there somehow. Like, how does that happen?
Well, I used to work on the oil, mining, gas industry. So that's a near perfect example of just, I guess what I'm talking about is the asymmetry of information, right? So big oil companies, have unbelievable access to talent, right, to negotiate the best possible contracts versus, governments that, really don't have that skill set at all to start off with. And the bigger the contracts get, perhaps the more challenging it may be for them to have those skill sets. Now, some governments can manage that, but I saw in the oil, mining and gas sector, you've got ExxonMobil negotiating against, like a relatively poor government in Africa, right, that maybe has one or two people who have contracting expertise, right, whereas they're bringing the best and finest kind of legal minds to bear. And it's just the asymmetry was just absolutely astounding. So you can scale that back or forwards depending on the industry you're talking about. And I don't particularly want to point at any one industry as worse than the others, but if you look at where the risks are and the rents are in government, it's, the things like big infrastructure projects. It's, like going to be the oil, mining and gas sector. It's also where, armaments and those kind of things. So everywhere the contracts are huge and there are huge businesses involved and government doesn't really have the skills to manage that. And that's where I think the challenge of mismanagement and efficiency grows the bigger the contracts get in some ways, because, so I think that's a challenge. I think the one things we're working with the World Bank, for example, is an extension to the open contracting data standard to cover public-private partnerships, because that's a great example where everyone can point to, some of those being really challenging. And at the same time, let's be frank, governments desperately need investment in infrastructure. So these things aren't going to go away. It's therefore how you do these in a really smart, efficient way. And there's a great example coming out of Brazil, which obviously is undergoing like the biggest ever corruption scandal, I think in potentially history, if you look at what's going on with Petrobras, Odebrecht, and just across the whole of Latin America. But there, that at heart is a government contracting scandal. There's also great examples in Minas Gerais, one of the Brazilian states, about managing public-private partnerships really transparently. There's a great blog actually by someone on the World Bank's website talking about why we published everything. Why don't you want to publish this? And I guess the philosophical point we're saying here, just to kind of wind it back for readers, is this is what's so interesting about this work, is it's the interface of both government and, corporate interaction, right? And it's the open contracting partnership is trying to really look at that interface and work out how to make it open by default. We're actually doing a piece of research at the moment and busting the myths of commercial confidentiality, because it's very easy to say, gosh, these contracts are commercially confidential. The answer is why and how and what is really confidential?
I was just going to say, are you putting the formula for Coke on the table here? I don't think so. Right?
Yeah, it's just interesting. But that's a great example, right? The formula for Coke shouldn't be in the government contract, right? So, the intellectual property perhaps behind, like iOS or whatever, right? It's Apple's operating system, right? There's no need to have to publish that in the government contract. You have intellectual property protection for that. That shouldn't be in the contract. So if government's doing contracts properly, the key performance indicators for delivering that contract should be in there, and they should be public, because why wouldn't you want to know how public money is spent? That should be in the contract. Take the stuff about, proprietary drilling technology out, because it's not relevant here, right? And if it is relevant, how do you then, there may be some things, like I'm trying to think of, say it's a very small contract for a care home for abused children, right? Those children have a right to privacy and everybody respects that. So open by default does not mean you publish everything in a really needless way. You think about the public interest stuff behind it, and there's a reason to redact it. have a clear process for that redaction, and you think about how to manage that. What you don't do is redact by default and have things closed by default. And that's why I think the shift happens. And then, sorry, on the stats about public procurement and just the risk, it's just worth saying it is government's number one corruption risk. There is no way of getting away from that. It's where the money and the power is, and, government discretion is largest, right? So how do you manage that risk? And the evidence for that is, if you look at the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, something like 60% of bribes are paid for government contracts. So it's clearly the thing that keeps going wrong most. And I had the honor, you kind of referred to it earlier on, to work for Global Witness. So Global Witness was an amazing anti-corruption watchdog that used to specialize in cutting edge investigations into who stole the money and naming and shaming. And then trying to sort of deal with how you would change the system, to address that kind of problem in the future. The Open Contracting Partnership really takes that a step further to think about how do you stop the money getting stolen in the first place, right? So that's what fascinated me to the shift was, wow, I could create 1,000 global witnesses here who can use that information to look at what's going wrong, but also, how do you sort of shift the default so that the stuff stops going wrong and, prevent, if you like, close the stable door before the horse has bolted. And I think that's really the interesting challenge of where we should be getting to globally over the next 5 years. Yeah.
And I want to talk about the challenges because I think those are really important. But you had started enumerating these 4 points, right? So the first one was value for money. What were the other 3 points that are the key value drivers, basically?
Yeah, so the key value drivers, value for money, right? Governments will better value for money. We spoke about public integrity, so making sure things don't go wrong. The other 2 are equally really interesting. There is citizens, and people monitoring the actual completion of contracts. So where's my road? Where's my school? Where's my hospital? And then lastly, and equally importantly, it's about businesses, right? It's about businesses wanting fair access to contracts. And how do you create a fair level playing field? And I honestly think businesses will be one of the largest consumers of government contracting information, because businesses both want to win contracts, and particularly every government around the world is trying to kind of grow the small to medium-sized business sector, because that's going to be the engine of economic growth, right? You often see both in the UK, the US, and elsewhere, central mandated kind of federal government targets to do more business with SMEs, right? And trying to prioritize that. They need key bits of information to get in the game, right? And one of those is understanding what government contracts look like. Mm-hmm. So it's surprising about how useful it is to see government contracts. Also, equally importantly, is just understanding, well, what contracts are available in my space? How do you, bring those together in a useful way and push those into the hands of businesses? So one of the countries we've been working in is Paraguay on open contracting, and there it's been used for 2 things. One is about, looking at government efficiency in contracting. So in this case, looking at different ministries and the length of time it takes them to complete that. But also it's about cutting edge analytics to push out opportunities to small businesses. So you can get an app on your phone that's listing all the contracts that are coming up in an area you're interested in. But it's also, you didn't get that contract, have you thought about this one? It's really quite proactively pushing that information into the hands of both entrepreneurs of all levels, but particularly SMEs really benefit from that. They haven't got the time to invest in navigating what is incredibly cumbersome and difficult to navigate bureaucracy about how government awards contracts. They haven't got the time to do that. They're trying to survive and thrive in the marketplace. One
of the things that you were triggering with me as you were in the middle of that explanation was the push for efficiency in government seems to also lead towards larger and larger awards. Especially as we see in the social sector, at least in the United States, IDIQs, the indefinite
delivery, indefinite quantity.
Yeah, exactly. One contract, it's umpteen gajillions of dollars that is then handed to 1 or 2 organizations that then have a quote unquote consortium. How does a small business, get into this? How does a medium-sized business even start to navigate this? Where do they even have a chance to compete in these larger contracts? Does government start to chunk up things too much and then sort of just make the field non-competitive?
Great question. I wouldn't give an exact answer to the chunking size, but what's interesting is thinking about, for example, Mexico is building a huge new airport, right? The government is using the open contracting data standard to assemble and share all the different contracts at different levels. And I think getting the data on all the contracts in one place and aggregated by project is really useful to begin to look at that chunking system and learning over time how you might is chunk the right word? I don't know how you might, divide those quantities up. And then in the UK, so the UK is adopting the open contracting data standard for what's called Contracts Binder, which is designed to bring all UK government contracts into one place and make them kind of accessible. And they are trying to look at exactly how to break those things up and render the subcontracting opportunities more available to business. So I think that kind of making it more available to SMEs appears, depending on, doesn't really matter what size you are, there's still that challenge, and open data can play a very important role. I would also say there's more than just open data. It's actually about how you do the contracts, and how you create and form contracts is vital to think about those things. And part of that is also having a better dialogue with the marketplace to start off with. So I'm trying to think of an example without mentioning the company, but there's one very large, like company we were sort of talking to, and they were saying they don't really bid for government contracts, but then just because they don't really buy into the process about how it's done, and it's so cookie cutter and derivative, it just feels like one contract's copied from another, and there's no innovation there. But then like Latin American countries said, actually, we want someone to, rather than saying we need 50,000 kilometers of plastic pipe, we want someone to stop leakage, by 50%. And come up with solutions around that. So there's a whole different way of narrativizing about smart contracts that kind of is appearing. It's not something we are enormously expert in, but I'm completely with you about that's the frontier of innovation, is this whole dialogue with the marketplace to actually think about the solution before you try to come up with a mega contract that does that.
My God, if I could just start to see a landscape that you just described where it's rather than, 50,000 miles of plastic pipe that, we want you to reduce leakage by 50%, literally the universe would change. Right? I mean,
you are so right.
Seeking a solution. And then obviously the back end of that is the really difficult part, right? Because now you're talking about the technical expertise on managing that contract from the government side and being able to follow up and not only oversee the solution that's presented, but then say, hey, at what point is it working? Is it not working? I mean, there's a whole lot to unpack there, but wow, how gorgeous would that be? Rather than saying you need to procure 10,000 tires of this quantity and, this rubber weight and this strength and la, 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 nope, we want trucks that go. I can't even begin to imagine the types of challenges that you experience. You came into the organization in 2015. Was the standard already created at that stage, or was that part of your flagship that you've put together?
So the standard was already created at that point. So the prototype of the standard, sort of version 1.0, we've just gone through a 1.1 upgrade. Just to talk about the standard for a second. So as I said, it's kind of an open data schema to assemble. It's JSON, so it's structured data, if that makes sense to your listeners. There are lots of, one-to-many relationships in public procurement about how, for example, you break a contract in subcontracts. So having sort of a structured hierarchy to assemble that and log changes to government contracts over time as they kind of morph and proliferate is really important. So, but it's also not a pass or fail stand. It's about how do you begin to assemble a coherent chain of that data so that people know what is going on and can follow the process. And we've been speaking about the importance of that planning stage where government has a dialogue with the marketplace, and then through to the solicitation, I guess you'd say in the US, or the tender and award of the contracts, and then their implementation. And it's not a pass or fail. It's about how do you create really effective kind of a chain of custody for that information, then make it accessible and shareable and digestible to non-experts, right? So user-friendly dashboards and metrics and analytics. And actually just today, one of our partners we work with has just created a really useful kind of red flags, like dashboard. So if you're creating open up data, you can screen those to like flag, perhaps some questionable procurement processes. Doesn't mean they're corrupt, but it does mean you should pay more attention to them. So say you have a particular department that consistently issue single bid contracts with unusual technical specifications that are universally more expensive than their peer group, that tend to go to offshore shell companies, then perhaps you should be asking some questions about what's going on. So
nothing strange there. Nothing strange there at all.
And it happens all too regularly, unfortunately.
As we've written in the blog that accompanies this podcast over at apreneur.com, we have quite a section just called the baked contract, right? I mean, we see it all the time in the social sector where, hey, we need a company that can, operate in Kazakhstan and, happens to be gender experts and happens to be, X, Y, 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 And there's only one person or company in the world that happens to be able to do that. Strange how that worked.
Amazing.
And we've all seen it. So, that never happens. When you wake up every day, what is it that you guys are looking at and interested in overcoming over the next 2 or 3 years?
Sure. So it's just worth saying, getting out of it. Public procurement is, hugely opaque, and it's kind of a dull subject.
I don't know. I'm having a good time talking about it here. I think this is pretty fun.
Do you know what I mean? It's vital for roads, schools, and hospitals and things citizens care about, but people really notice it when it goes wrong, right? There aren't that public procurement people themselves see themselves as kind of watchdogs and process experts, but they aren't rewarded for innovation and creativity, right? So there's a huge institutional challenge in just getting government to get its own head around public procurement. It's not necessarily the skill set that is most rewarded in government. Thinking about politicians, they just want stuff to happen. They aren't, tracking what's going on.
Well, in government, again, we've said it here on the show many times, where government is rewarded for stability. It's not rewarded for change, right? I mean, that's what people look to their government to create stability in their lives. And so if the government is a constant innovator, there's a disconnect there for them.
Yeah, and so the number one sort of challenge we face, I think, is just that kind of government inertia. I think if I was going to say that's the bureaucratic satisficing, if you're going to be technical about it, just the way kind of institutions limp along and, almost like squash change. You can imagine the guy saying, all right, I'm going to open the process up to transparency where everyone can see everything. That's like a career-ending move if you get it wrong.
And not only that, it's not only career-ending, but it's also just the impossibility. I mean, this is what Trump is seeing now in the U.S. government, right? And I'm not sure, I don't have other better examples around the world, but you just can't go and try to punch that big ball of gelatin. There's just incredible inertia that's just like, you know what? We procured this 3 years ago and we put the tender out 5 years ago. We're not changing anything for you, right? These things are in process.
Totally. And I've got a great story about that it's the UK. It's Government Digital Services who were brought in to just look at the UK government IT contracting. And for those of you who don't know, in the past there's been a car crash, massively, hugely over budget contracts. And
one website, my friend, healthcare.gov, my friend, in the United States. Okay.
Enough said, right? Yeah, exactly. A perfect example. But the UK government itself, when they were reviewing this, used the word oligopoly, right? So we'll get into that other challenge of the vested interests who don't want change, the oligopolists, if you like, is a challenge. But they actually went out and they asked people, what do you want from a government contract? They actually asked the UK IT people. And people fell off their seats. No one ever asked them what they wanted from a contract before. And the average UK government IT contract takes 9 hours without a bathroom break to read from start to finish. And basically they hacked on the contract. They just had a bit of a creative session. They got it down to 3 hours, right? And with a summary of key terms right at the front to bring those forwards. And so there's just, some simple, smart things. But I think just that inertia is just totally palpable. We are totally privileged to work with the smartest and most canny people in government who are genuinely trying to make a change, around the world. Just, amazing people from Nigeria, from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, from Mexico, and even, in Europe, right? Thinking of France, particularly in Italy, just the incredible people who are really trying to make a difference. But they face this every day and they're continually trying to work out how not to be crushed by this sort of inertia. And also, if you think about the risk of opening stuff up, governments are nervous about this because it means that perhaps some of their, things that aren't on display or, cock-ups that can be swept under the carpet are suddenly in public view. And so it's quite, unless you're brave, right, and you're genuinely recognize that this will make a difference over the long term.
Is there an amnesty clause you could put in there, or something is that ever a part of your process where you're like, look, you could open things up and we're going to say, hey, bygones be bygones. What happened in the past happened in the past. I don't know if is that a part of your conversation?
So I think the first thing we would say is, look at the transformational upside of doing this, the amount of money you can save, the fact that you will, grow your supplier base and, do more business with SMEs that you really want to do. Plus, you'll also start rebuilding trust with citizens is overall, our job is to capture the data to be able to share that, to make that a compelling proposition. It depends on the different sort of approaches. So in Nigeria, there's this amazing group of citizen monitors called the Public-Private Development Centre who take government contracts. They've mostly been using freedom of information. They're now using the Open Track Data Standard to assemble and share that information. And they go out, often, in boats up in river states, for example, in Nigeria, around the Delta, looking at whether then the contract has been fulfilled. And like the, primary health centre, which is like the basic sort of clinic providing services to the surrounding community, has been built, right? And they are doing that. They're not doing that to name and shame the government. They're doing that to improve delivery of citizen services. So they're much more about working with that particular department of Nigerian government to make things better and to get better provision. In some cases, they found the clinics like mothballed and closed. There's an investigation into why. But the main thing is, well, why don't you reopen it and how do you reopen it? And, thinking about how to get things done. So I think there's a calculus for each individual country about the balance of power, about how much is in the past and how much is in the future. We are the people who then go through the contracts to name and shame. We're trying to build a field of policy and practice around this whole different thing. I think the users of data tends to be business who tend to kind of complain. They see a dodgy contract in real time that tends to prevent that contract happening. So to give you an example of that, getting tenders cancelled in Ukraine when they are obviously dodgy because they're for $100 mops with some mad specification that only one person can fulfill. There's a very nice one actually about the Eurovision Song Contest. I don't know how many fans are listening to that.
Hey, I love the Eurovision. Nice.
Yeah, who doesn't know? I just love the mix of different countries that take part. But there, Ukraine, was the host, which is really exciting. There was a public contract for a facelift for the station for Ukraine. And there was a monitoring portal that was tracking that. And basically that contract had more complaints than probably any other contract that anyone was monitoring, right? So there was clearly something that went on. They were able to rectify that. And I think, the contract was sort of retendered, reallocated, and they got things together in time. So it's quite interesting. It's that sort of challenge, if you like. How do you prevent things going wrong rather than picking up the pieces? And I think that's the ultimate promise. But you're right, there is that calculus. So inertia is the key challenge.
I'm just trying to think over the last, let's just say 5-6 years. I'm thinking, Brazil Olympics. I'm thinking Winter Olympics in Russia. I'm thinking the last World Cup. I'm thinking healthcare.gov. I'm thinking, the computer system for the FBI in the United States. Are there bright lights? Are there bright stories of these large government contractors? And now, because I want to kind of steer us towards that vested interest thing where it just seems like, do we always end up with crap at the end of these large things? Obviously, roads get built and bridges get built and these kinds of things. But wow, I'm starting to struggle now with the good stories.
Sure. One we're really interested in tracking and sharing the story of will be Mexico City's new airport. So this is going to be the 5th biggest infrastructure project in the world. It's going to be around about $10 billion US, I think, in total. It's going to be absolutely huge. They are using and publishing open contracting data at the moment. And they want to aggregate it to kind of create a sort of dashboard about, is this project on time and on budget? So I think that could be a really good test case about the promise of open contracting, both the data and the business civic engagement to deliver smarter, more responsive infrastructure projects in future. Think about the global, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think that investment in infrastructure, there's this incredible gap, right, about infrastructure the world needs. I think open contracting can serve a role there. We're working on a really interesting project with just more a cheerleader for it. We're not part of the consortium directly, as it were, but people who are monitoring EU regional funds. So this is regional development funds, over €1 billion worth of funds in 10 different countries using what they call integrity packs, where citizen monitors are kind of plumbed into the process right from the start, and they're using the open contracting approach to kind of unlock every aspect of the kind of information behind that and share that and monitor in real time. And so that could be really interesting. I think there may be emerging best practice. I can tell you what the impacts will be in 5 years' time, and maybe we can talk about that. Other sort of challenges, there are some examples of infrastructure that has been built really effectively on time and on budget under pretty frighteningly challenging conditions. One I know of locally is Heathrow Airport's Terminal 5, which was a really tricky thing because of actually building it while they were operating one of the world's busiest airports. So it can be done. It isn't rocket science. I think that kind of absolute transparency and clarity and effectiveness is absolutely crucial to that. And I think the openness acts as a bit of a spur to everyone's flanks to get their act together and stop slippage. So I think that can be really useful.
And I personally love Terminal 5. Thank you very much. I'm an airport contrarian, I think. Lots of people like to complain about bad airports, but I think airports are pretty fantastic places. How do you keep the ship afloat? I'm assuming governments aren't giving you money to do this. I saw that the Fund for the City of New York gives you money. Is that right?
So we are fiscally sponsored by the Fund for City of New York. So the Fund for City of New York was built by the Ford Foundation and others in, I think, the 1960s to promote civic innovation and better government in small g, particularly for citizens of New York and New York State, but then also, to share those ideas around the world. So we're plugged into that global civic innovation sort of space through them. So fiscally sponsored means that they provide our back office and everything else, and then 501c3 status in the US, the not-for-profit status, which then allows us to scale as a project a lot faster and more efficiently, rather than creating a new institution to do this. So that's awesome what they provide for us. Our main funders, there's all on our website and people go and check it out directly. We publish both our funders, our financials, we're sort of super transparent ourselves, and we publish all our contracts, of course, but we also sort of publish how we're doing. We have a dashboard ourselves on how we're achieving our targets, and we cock up, we make mistakes, and we try to publish those openly. I can talk about those as well if that's useful, but so we do all that. Our main funders, people like the Omidyar Foundation, founded by Pierre Omidyar, eBay founder, just to talk about that, they really think about how can open data transform society. And this is like a key part of kind of the promise of open data, that you can actually genuinely measure the impact. And, we are trying to do that. So they are supporting us in that. They're one of our big sort of funders. Another one I want to shout out to, if that's okay, would be the Arnold Foundation. So John and Laura Arnold are really interested in kind of data-driven government, and they are supporting us in, for example, our work in Ukraine to genuinely sort of capture and measure the impacts about large-scale interventions to prevent corruption. And they're also really interested in civic transparency and anti-corruption in the UK at the kind of city level. Sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you for giving a shout out to both of those. I was just mentioning, you said that even you cock up, right? Like that you're the open contracting partnership, but even you make mistakes. I mean, how critical is that to be able to recognize, flag, admit, and just sort of have an acceptable environment where you're like, hey, you know what? We screwed that one up. Like that just didn't work. Let's learn from it and move on. But let's catch the mistake before it becomes an institutionalized disaster. Right? I mean, ultimately, do you find that that's the fine line of being able to admit that you made a mistake? I just wonder, in a lot of these places, I'm thinking again of healthcare.gov or whatever, at some point, someone in that contractor, that IT contractor said, you know what, this is not going to work. But there was such, again, inertia that they probably just weren't able to raise their hand effectively. Have you seen that in government as well? Or is it just because it's this giant blob where, you can't really put your finger on who's supposed to raise their hand? Or have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so owning our mistakes makes us stronger. And actually, it's very liberating. It's just worth saying that. So, like the biggest mistake we've made is not to be user-driven enough. Just to unpack that for a second. Yeah, one of the challenges we've sometimes seen is governments want to do transparency for transparency's sake, just because it's the kind of right thing to do. So let's be a bit more open. And that tends to lead to, I'm trying to think of the correct word for it, perhaps quite a shallow implementation of what is possible, right? So unless it genuinely makes the lives of frontline procurement wonks, if I can use that word, better, and gives them better data to do their jobs more smartly and make their lives better, then it feels like a kind of extraneous imposition. Transparency has been done to people, not done with them. So I think that's the biggest mistake we've made. And, we've done that in certain things. And one was actually, to talk about it, was we're talking to a US government agency about that. And, we really wanted to we didn't focus enough on, they don't have to give money to other US government agencies. And we didn't focus enough talking to them about the user needs, about why this would be transformational for their impact on the ground. And it just therefore didn't really take root. So that's a sort of clear cock up we made. So in terms of government, the inertia is powerful and quite terrifying. But then there's great bright spots as well. It's amazing what you can get done if the machinery aligns. So I'm thinking of how, for example, just to give a positive story about how the British government completely reversed its position. It's one of the twin pillars of financial secrecy globally around capturing and sharing the information about who really owns companies, not the legal shareholders, but the warm bodies behind that, so-called the persons of significant control or the beneficial owners. And, that changed really fast. Now, the UK catches that information and is sharing it in an accessible format. And that changed over from being completely against this idea to completely for it really fast. So it's amazing when the gears mesh. It's wonderful to see. Ukraine is another example. With one more to cite, Nigeria. Nigeria is, I think, they will admit themselves, a public contracting, and corruption is, people tend to think of Nigeria when you talk about that, right? But then you've got this incredible collaboration between these Nigerian entrepreneurs behind this, approach called Budeshi that I was talking about, which means open it and Hausa. They are genuinely cracking open government contracts, looking inside and seeing where they've been built. But they've then been able to pitch that to the Buhari administration to actually scale up across, the Nigerian government. So some things genuinely happen on this. And I hope that will be launched over the next few months, where they'll, for the first time, actually be putting some information out about government contracts online in a really accessible way. And that can make a big difference over time. Doesn't mean there won't be terrifying corruption scandals in Nigeria, but it's how do you begin to shift the default and just shift the calculus for wrongdoing, right? So I'm kind of relentlessly optimistic. I mean, I've made terrible calls on my optimism in the past. And just to give you one, so that people just unplug the podcast and take their earphones off and go, by God, this guy's an idiot. But, there was a bit when Libya, after Gaddafi, I was in Tripoli, and it was amazing to talk about how oil could be, the servant of the people rather than its master, right? It was, really, there was a real sense of opportunity there, which has completely disappeared now. Obviously, now it's terrifying sort of, situation. But there was a sense of promise for that moment. And I'm always a believer that you've got to seize those moments. And you have Libya in one case and you have Ukraine on the other, right? So, I'm always like, for us, what keeps us going is that opportunity to kind of shift at the fault. And, there's the kind of everyday work of making government a bit better. And then there's the kind of transformational upside where, anything's possible. Like, it'd be really interesting to see how our pitch works with Macron and En Marche in France. That would be really exciting. France, there's some great people in Etalab there who are thinking about digital modernization and smarter government in France. And we've got a collaboration going about open contracting that can make a big difference to citizen services there.
Gavin, as with most of our guests, I could probably sit here and talk to you for the next 3 hours, but I don't think that we can do that, unfortunately. 2 final questions for you. Who do you pay attention to stay up on things? Not only in open contracting, but in corruption, in transparency, in whatever it is that you need to know in order to make sure that the open contracting partnership continues to thrive. Twitter feeds, magazines you read, just, information, data streams in general that you think other people should know about?
Yeah, so I definitely think the work done by people like Warren Smith at Government Digital Services in the UK is like supremely creative and disruptive. So that's an example of sort of, let's call it stuff within government that's like fascinating to see how they are thinking about things. I really follow. There's obviously a much wider open government community. If people wanted to follow Semba Niaga, who's in charge of Udeshi in Nigeria, I think that's amazing. I think there's that Pro-Zorro team and how they are then trying to take their whole public procurement solution of Pro-Zorro global and share that with people. That's amazing. There's a lot of thought leadership coming from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development at the moment around public procurement reform and really smart ways of doing that. This stuff is innately bureaucratic, but they're the least bureaucratic and kind of smartest moving kind of actor perhaps in that space. The World Bank has new leadership on their public procurement sort of program, and I'm really excited by that. Vinay Sharma, who's come from the African Development Bank, I think that will be really interesting to see how he interprets that mandate. Given where we came from the World Bank, we have close links there. It'll be really fun seeing how he disrupts the World Bank status quo. A shout out to, in terms of owning your mistakes and really thinking about how data gets used to create change. I think it would be worth talking about. There's a great organization in New York City called Reboot, who are, think about the ethnography of data and the ethnology as well. And I think that's like totally fascinating. I also love Alan Hudson running Global Integrity. So they are really thinking about adaptive learning, right, for governance. And that's like really interesting beyond just what we do, but really how you kind of have that sort of sense of iteration and repeating and, how data is innately political and therefore, how it links to create political change. I think, the Media Network, like transformational silo busters by, like their inclination. So people like Martin Tisney and Laura Bacon, and are really worth paying attention to in that space. So it's a bit of a scattergun there from different people.
That was an amazing list. Thank you so much for that. That's fantastic.
I should put them all in the podcast notes, right?
And they will. No, we'll put them all in the notes for everybody for sure. Last question for you is, if you think outside open contracting for a second, you're lucky enough, you had a lot of time at Global Witness. You've been around the block for quite a long time. Is there an innovation or something in the social sector that's out there that you would just love to give a shout out to that you just think is the bee's knees and isn't getting enough press right now?
So I think the whole clean contracting approach that TI is bringing in, think about reforming government contracts, but from a particularly kind of citizen monitoring transparency point of view is really exciting. See how their project will scale over time. And TI is the kind of, the global movement of anti-corruption and public integrity kind of, organizations. I think that's kind of really exciting. I think that's in its nascent sort of phase. Full disclosure, I'm on the advisory board of that, but I'm kind of excited by seeing where they take that because, we work with so many different TI chapters and that's really exciting. I mean, Global Witness as ever does awesome investigations into bad stuff. I'm really excited by what's going on with open ownership. So open ownership is, again, we're part of the collaboration, but that's about creating a kind of global register of who owns corporations. And that could be really interesting because that's a very natural and exciting complement to understanding, okay, who got the contract, what company. And that's a kind of important part of the transparency. You need to understand both the companies and how they're operating, and you also need to understand the different levels of government. So I think there's some people doing amazing stuff on actually creating the kind of heuristics to navigate different levels of government and creating what I guess you call an entity register. I think Open Data Services, one of the smartest people working on open data standards around the world. And then lastly, two things I just pay attention to personally. One is, I think it's worth shouting out to the tax justice movement. The way they've built a movement around tax is fascinating, because it's a bit like public contracting. It's not something that immediately would excite people, but obviously is a vital function of government. They're how the money comes in, we're how the money goes out, if you like. That's why I see an analogy to what we're trying to do. And then it seems silly not to sort of mention it. Just thinking about the blockchain type stuff and smart contracts and what that means for how government does business in the longer term, that would be super exciting, right? So, and then how all the sequences and of the processes that we do link up with the actual, could they be embedded into a single kind of blockchain type approach? And then we'll not oversell that, or people talk about too much, but I think that's really interesting. And then there's people like Cadastre, which is trying to do a kind of blockchain for land contracts. So it directly crosses over to the kind of transparency of, who owns land, and land tenure is essential part of kind of, basically tackling poverty, the whole Hernando de Soto argument about accumulation of capital.
Gavin, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Total pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I've had an amazing time. I better go and cast my vote now. Thanks so much, Stephen.
That's right. Cheers. Hey guys, just one more reminder. If you find value in what you're listening to, like these conversations with Gavin, click on subscribe or the like button, or even better, give us a review on iTunes. And you can always contact me, Facebook, Twitter, or on aidpreneur.com. Thanks. You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.